Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as cEDH. I'm one of your hosts, Lyndon, aka Noobzaurs. And today, we have a very special episode for you. We are resuming special episodes, and today we're going to be doing a special episode on Godo Bandit Warlord. So we've taken a brief hiatus from special episodes, partially due to the complexity and difficulty in organizing them and coordinating everyone's schedules, which we were maybe a bit too cavalier with how frequently we thought we'd get these done, but we're ideally going to be getting more of these out to you soon. But also, we kind of put the special episodes on hold during the Thassa's Oracle Flash Hulk, winter, Fish Hulk winter, because, talking about decks like Godo just doesn't really make sense when, there is really only one deck and the fringe had been kind of eliminated. So now that is gone, very excited to get back to it with special episodes, and Godo Bandit Warlord cEDH is definitely a deck that has a special place in my heart. Well, so that's enough about me. In this episode, I will be acting as host and question master for the most part, but I am joined by a panel of expert guests. So with us today, we have Nick, aka InsertCleverPhraseHere.
Hi, good to join you.
Tony, aka gtoast99.
Hello.
And Azurel.
Uh-huh.
So Tony and Nick are both, I guess, co-authors on the Godo primer, and have been there since the early days of everyone brewing with Helm the host on the mono red server, and Azurel also there since the beginning, and we've got some conflicting opinions on directions and certain cards, and Azurel here is here to voice. Give some dissenting opinions so everyone isn't just nodding in agreement. Azurel's
I'm the devil's advocate here.
Got a very, very nice list, and we'll be linking to the primer and a bunch of lists that we referenced throughout the episode in the show notes. So be free to check those out. But yeah, so let's just talk about what this episode is going to be about. So yeah, this podcast is going to focus more on the nitty-gritty stuff of Godo. We're assuming you have a reasonable knowledge of the deck and its functioning. This isn't like an intro primer about the deck. This is for really getting into leveling up someone who's probably played the deck a few times or is familiar with the basic concepts, and getting advice from the foremost experts on the deck. So we're going to be talking about what your average game looks like, what turn do you typically try to combo out, how aggressively do you mulligan, and just this kind of advice, and some single card discussion. It's gonna be a blast. And one thing before we jump into it, I just want to give a shout out to Ishmokin, who is another top tier expert on Godo, but unfortunately we can only have so many people on our panel, so I just wanted to give that shout out. But yeah, before we get into some detailed discussion of the deck as it is now, as we did with the Gitrog special episode, I think it would be fun for our listeners to just kind of understand a bit of the history of the deck. And contrary to popular belief, the deck didn't just or there was actually interest in Godo before Helm the Host was printed, but that's really when the deck became it came into its own and became an actual tiered quote unquote cEDH list. But before that, I'll give a brief history, because not many people may know this, but even though I guess I do bring up Godo every now and then on the podcast, but I was actually involved in some of the developments early on in the lists. I chat with everyone on the mono red server and help make discussion on what things go into the list, despite not actually piloting Godo in cEDH at all, really. I play a casual Godo list, and as you'll soon find out when I talk about it, that casual Godo list is actually involved in some of the history of Godo cEDH. So I'll just jump into that. So as far as we know, there was some interesting origins of Godo. Right before Helm the Host, there was a combo that people were working on, and it wasn't very good. It was a very multi-card combo, but it all started from me making a casual or like mid-power Godo list involving the idea of casting Godo to find Blade of Selves, and then Blade of Selves attacking with Godo, then finding Masterwork of Ingenuity and Hammer of Nazan. So then the Masterwork would copy Blade of Selves, and then on your second attack, you could find all of the Cauldron pieces and World Slayer. So that was my like Godo combo initially. So your Godo would be indestructible, all the Cauldron pieces would be indestructible, and then you'd be left with a World Slayer that you can destroy all permanents every turn with. And you just close out the game that way. So that was my original idea. And then Hisp, a member of the Mono Red Discord, took inspiration from the idea of the Blade of Selves, Hammer of Nazan, and Masterwork, and then he kind of spun that off into a completely different direction. So what he did was he was doing things with, and this is crazy, kudos to him for figuring this out. Blade of Selves, Masterwork of Ingenuity, Hammer of Nazan, and he'd go find on the second attack, Mortar Pod, Nim Deathmantle, Death Render, and Heirloom Blade. And there was this crazy combo involving like goblins and Neheb and all kinds of stuff. So this idea was eventually found by Average Dragon, notorious cEDH brewer and community member, and refined a bit. And there was discussion on the Mono Red Discord about how to optimize this combo. There was some meme, Godo combo decks, and then Helm the Host got spoiled, and all of that went out the window. And from that moment, we got Insert, Tony, Azrael, and a bunch of members of the Mono Red community, brewing around Godo Helm combo.
From there, Mono Red.
I actually never played cEDH before this. I played a casual to high power Godo list that I enjoyed the shit out of, and when they broke my favorite commander, it dragged me into cEDH. So I guess that's one extra way of joining cEDH.
What about you, Tony? Were you doing other things before Helm, or was this your foray into cEDH?
This was around the time my play group was in the arms race that you see all too often. And so I was piloting some ridiculous Zakama land destruction stacks deck. And Helm of the Host was... as soon as I saw that card spoiled, I knew that I wanted to try cEDH. This was the card I wanted to do it with. And so a bunch in my play group had... started proxying up like Tazuri and that sort of thing, and just straight primer lists, and said, well, we don't know what we're doing, but let's try it. And I was the one in the group that said, I'm going to try to brew something else and see if it works. And it was off to the races.
Awesome. And interesting too, when Godo was first brewed, there was actually several different directions that it was taken. I remember my first Helm Godo brew was a stacks oriented build. I was running Tabernacle and a bunch of stacks pieces. Some people were on all in combo, running every single red ritual down to a desperate ritual, pyretic ritual.
That's where I was at.
And
I was at pedal to the metal. Let's go fast.
Godo has kind of come a long way since then to be more of a unified list where it's running aspects of stacks all in combo, and it's really kind of a chimera of all of those original lists, which is pretty interesting. Let's talk about Godo and the current meta. So throughout this episode, I'll be mentioning some listener questions that we've sourced from the Mono Red Discord, if they relate to the topic at hand, and at the very end of the episode, we'll be covering some listener questions that we didn't cover. So Sage Grouse asks, I'd like to hear about the changes in the meta and how that has affected and interacted with Godo, and are we seeing more or less answers to our win attempts after Flash Winter. And then Ishmaelkin also asks, how well positioned is Godo in the possible top table matchups versus, Turbo Adnaz Breach decks or highly interactive decks like Thrasios Midrange?
I'll go in regard to the Turbo Adnaz matchup. So I've actually played a decent amount with River May Cry on Blue Farm with Godo, and so far I'm positive. I've won at least 2 games versus him, and they're all games where I won between turns 2 and turn 4. So you definitely have the racing aspect down. It's just the interacting part which is harder. I don't know how others have you fared versus some of these decks.
I guess against highly interactive decks, I feel like that hasn't really changed that much to before the Flash Winter, I guess, when I sort of stopped playing for a little while, at least. I think that Godo has a lot of stacks that really hits those decks hard. They tend to play a lot of colors. Blood Moons are really effective. They tend to play a lot of counter spells and stuff for non-creature spells. They don't really do much against us, or at least they don't stop the main combo. So, yeah, some good advantages there. Godo generally does well against them, I think. Yeah. What do you think, Tony?
Tony, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we're in a really good spot now that the incredibly low mana instant speed win con is gone. We can still race with some of the best decks for sure, but if they want to slow the game down and play a mid-range game, we can win that too. We can play the stacks of your hands. So I think we're in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, well, one thing I'll add is that I think the Blood Moon and Back to Basics decks are very well positioned in the post-Flash meta due to the fact that Oracle is kind of consolidated at the top of the format, and everybody's running Tainted Pact mana bases, which get punished pretty freaking hard by Blood Moon and Back to Basics decks. So the non-basic land hate aspect of Godo's stacks pieces is just very strong. And honestly, a lot of the stacks pieces that Godo's running are just powered up a bit based on how the meta has shifted. But yeah,
I think the other harder matchups now would actually be decks that are more focused around multicolor red decks, because they run Dockside as well, and that's a pretty good out to Blood Moon. And
that is one thing that sort of made Blood Moon a little less effective semi-recently, was the printing of Dockside Extortionists. So it obviously powers our deck up a bit as well, but I think it's actually better against us than it is in our deck, just because they get to sidestep the Blood Moon. They get to bank off of us having lots of artifacts, which we pretty much always will do. So it's also just something that encourages people to play red, which obviously depowers Blood Moon if people are playing red in their deck already.
And then I do think one thing that is also a bit of a detriment for Godo is the fact that Force of Vigor has gone up in popularity as people are anticipating things going into more mid-range and grindy, and Rule of Laws being present. People are packing Force of Vigors more often, which is, of course, a Godo player's worst nightmare.
Yeah, it's very funny because when Flash was legal and Oracle was legal, people were actually cutting Nature's Claim and Swords of Plowshare. And now that it's gone, people will move back towards those. Oh yeah, especially with as we'll discuss later. And I guess we can bring up now, Drannith being a big part of the meta now is hard for any expensive commander or commander-centric deck. So along with people running Drannith, which is obviously a very strong piece against Godo, people are also packing more removal for Drannith. So Swords to Plowshares, as Azrael pointed out, are going back into lists. Yeah.
I mean, we did get some cool.
But then by the same token, you got Deflecting Sword.
Yeah, we got some cool new tech too. We've also found some new tech in Conqueror's Flail, which kind of was always around, but we sort of only recently rediscovered, I guess.
Okay, so speaking of some of the cards that we can run to answer this, let's move into some single card discussion regarding the deck. So here we're going to be talking about some some more contentious cards, not just going over, every single obvious card in the list. We're not going to be spending time talking about Dockside Extortionist because, you're red, you run Dockside Extortionist. So a few people from the red server say, so Bear, what are more niche cards / interactions you should be aware of? And then Gappy, says, what cards do you feel are either overused or underused? So yeah, those answers will be covered. And in our first category, we're going to be talking about some ramp pieces. So here we've got Worn Power Stone and Coalition Relic are ones that do not see play in Tony or Nick's primer list, but Azrael and some people Azrael runs them, and some people might be wondering, why don't you run these kinds of ramp pieces? Do you guys want to speak to that?
I guess I'll answer first. So the reason why I like Worn Power Stone and Coalition Relic still, Coalition Relic probably a little more of our Worn Power Stone, is that these are individual cards, so they take up one slot that produce multiple mana. Yes, Worn Power Stone does enter tapped, but unless it's always on turn 3, it usually doesn't matter too much. Coalition Relic, I think it's a little better because you can hold up some interaction still after you play it, and if you don't need to do anything, you just charge it. And I think, at least at that use case, it's fine. And sometimes we're slightly starved for red mana in case of Coalition Relic, so that's why I still play it.
Yeah.
Tony, Nick, why don't you run them?
Because I'm a ramp snob. Honestly, I'm snobby about my ramp. We have so many options, and I just don't think they quite hit the bar. I'm not going to look down on someone for playing them. I look for. I don't think they quite hit that level for me.
They fall short of allowing me to combo off on the turn when I want to be able to be ready to combo off. Now, I want to. Ideally, with this deck, I want to be ready to combo off on turn 3 or earlier. Mostly, I think it just gives you more options to when you're reading the table and you think, okay, now's my time. The earlier you can have that available, the better. I feel like Worn Power Stone and Coalition Relic just fall a little short of that. They sort of enable good reliable wins, I think, on turn 4 or later. But I just feel like I want my deck to be a little faster than that. I think Azrael has a different opinion on that. I think he's better. He's more aiming towards a little bit slower, but a little bit more of a resilient and stacksy list with a little bit more. You're trying to grind out the win a little bit more.
So I guess I'll touch on this a little bit and then we can move on. But one thing I've learned from talking with the Schmoken and the Finns in regards to ad nauseum decks is you need a certain amount of mana sources to really be consistent and have explosivity. And while we do still have a lot, regardless if you don't include these two, it helps not just in recovery, but you have multiple points where you're casting Godo as far as mana amounts. So you have 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 11 are the key points of mana that you usually need. 4 being the ideal one, which is that Treatise Ogre. But after that, you start getting to where you want to just start playing as many mana sources as you can. And that's why I like including these, because all you really need is this deck is mana to win, at least. And I don't think that's a big problem for this deck by including these.
Yeah. So and then some other of the ramp pieces we have on this list that are cards that that aren't usually run, and that's Scorched Ruin and some of the tapped colored rocks for 2 CMC. And I wanted to get your guys' opinion on why these cards aren't run. So I think Scorched Ruin is a land that it taps for 4 generic mana, and when it enters, you need to sacrifice 2 untapped lands. And otherwise to keep it in play. So there's some consideration in my opinion on why wouldn't you run something that's like a soul land? Because you run all the other soul lands and you run Crystal Vein and a bunch of lands that sack for mana. So why not this land?
I think the main problem with this is sort of what I was talking about with the turn you want to be able to go off. So Scorched Ruins doesn't allow you to go off on turn 3 unless you have a rock that taps for red that you have, because Scorched Ruins is going to get rid of both of your other lands, and then it only taps for colorless mana. And because we're sort of aiming for the most powerful rocks, most of them just produce colorless mana, so we're kind of limited on our red mana already. When you're throwing away 2 of your other lands, probably all of your red mana, you're now on turn 3, you've just played a land that taps for 4. You can use that to play like a Thran Dynamo or something and build up, but you're not going to be comboing off on turn 3 with it, which I think a card that only enables turn 4 combos is just not really what this deck is aiming for. It's just aiming to be a bit faster than that.
Okay, and then Tony, as a self-proclaimed ramp snob, do you want to talk about the tapped colored rocks? So these are like Fire Diamond, Cold Steel Heart, that sort of thing.
Yeah, they're just they're third tier rocks, and we play some third tier rocks, and that's fine. But there's enough options, I think, that we really get to be snobby about it. We get to choose what are the best ramp sources that we can have, and there definitely needs to be some trade-off between fast and single use and slower. I think Jeweled Amulet kind of splits the middle of that's a weird rock. A lot of people don't like that one. But things that just plain enter tapped for 2 mana are too slow. And then the flip side of that is if you just eschew rocks altogether and go, well, let's just play ramp sources that are rituals, then once you've burned the ritual, you get no recovery power from it at all. So you really do have to split the middle, but these are just too slow.
I think one thing that people also need to understand, compared to other decks where the color might be more important than the fact that it comes in untapped, Godo only really needs 1 red most of the time when it's trying to combo. 1 or 2 red, 1 for the actual Godo, and then maybe for some cost reducer like a Magnetic Theft. But a lot of the wins can actually be done with only a single red mana. So the color is less important than being able to, chain mana rocks.
I think we're aiming. You're aiming when you combo
rocks
to have 2 red mana available, though, because you want to be able to have mana for like a Red Blast or a Pyroblast or something like that. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and speaking of comboing, our next category is on the cost reducers. So most of the cost reducers in Godo are pretty standard and aren't going to change. They're just so high quality, but some of them are on the fringes, and some of the new ones that get printed see a lot of discussion. So kind of to list some of the main ones from the actual primer, you've got like Brass Squire, which can tap to attach an equipment, and so you can play that before you combo and reduces the combo from 11 mana to 6. Same with Panharmonicon when you're doing things with Hammer of Nazan, Heat Shimmer, Final Fortune, these kind of things. So there's almost a bifurcation between the pre-paying cost reducers, so things like the Panharmonicon and Brass Squire, and then the same turn combo cost reducers like Twin Flame, Heat Shimmer, Magnetic Theft. So a lot of the discussion right now is along the lines of the quote unquote prepaid cost reducers. So how many copies of Panharmonicon are really worth running? So the card Molten Echoes, which was printed in, I think that was Commander like 2020, and Cryptic Trilobite, I think that was also Commander 2020, are some...
Ikoria was for Cryptic Trilobite.
Okay, yeah, and so these are some cards that are used to prepay and get the cost reduction, but don't actually make the cut. Do you guys want to speak to why?
Yeah, I think that there's only so many of these sort of effects that you want because they don't stack, right? So once you have Panharmonicon, the others are redundant. Once you have Hammer of Nazan in your opening hand, you draw a Panharmonicon or Molten Echoes, they're not any good. Trilobite's kind of nice in that it allows you to like untap monoliths and stuff, so you can kind of filter mana through it that way if you have one of those. But in general, I think there's only so many of those sort of effects you need. Final Fortune's an interesting one because you get to like you take an extra turn and then you use your mana that untaps to pay for the equip. But it also costs a lot of red. There's actually 3 copies of it available, but we only run the instant speed one because it gives you the additional utility of being able to just sit there with 2 red mana open and another line to victory. Like maybe you have a Panharmonicon in play and you have tons of mana, but you want to be able to, or you have the combo using a different means. You don't need to use Final Fortune as a cost reducer, but you can like wait until someone's end step when everybody's tapped out. You can just be like, I'm gonna win now.
How, out of curiosity, how much consideration goes into the surprise factor versus the representing the win on board? So, a Panharmonicon, if you're going to untap and, make your land play and have 6 mana, you're telegraphing the win to all of your opponents. Whereas something like a Twin Flame or Heat Shimmer, even though Heat Shimmer might not make for the most efficient, cost reducer, the fact that it's 3 additional mana on top of your 6 mana commander, it's not completely telegraphed. How does that weigh into to consideration for reducers?
That's kind of like when we decide to run rituals versus more permanent base ramp. Like the rituals technically let you project less to your opponents, while the like, for example, Panharmonicon or like playing out a Thran Dynamo is more telegraphed. I think there's cases where you can run out a Panharmonicon and then next turn it just leads you up to like more protective plays, because you could like double a dock side and then go into Direfleet Devil, take somebody's interaction maybe they've used, and then go from there.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of there's a bit of 2 different sides to that coin. So they do allow you to, the prepaid cost reducers allow you to use your interaction more, but if you don't have interaction, it can be better to just be able to surprise people. But it also depends on who you're playing against. If you're playing against people who haven't played against the deck a lot, they'll maybe like count your mana and like, oh, is he ready to go off now? Is he not ready to go off? But people who are experienced against the deck will just be like, well, he can go off anytime. He just played Treasonous Ogre and win, so I'm going to keep my interaction up anyway. So kind of, yeah, there's a little bit of that. I think I love the surprise factor, but I think at the top tables in a tournament or whatever, it doesn't pay off as much. So you have to, I think the Panharmonicon effects become a little bit more powerful there, because they allow you to keep up your red blasts and your being able to drop down a defense grid or something like that before comboing off. You can do that with 8 mana with Panharmonicon, which is totally within range. But if you're paying for it all out, it's a little less available.
Okay, well, speaking of protection, that's our next category. So here we have things like Defense Grid, Conqueror's Flail. We've also got, Fork, which is one that isn't really run in the primer list. Slowbad, which isn't run the primer list, but I know Azrael wants to talk about it. So let's kick things off with where there's agreement, and that's on Defense Grid and Conqueror's Flail. How do these really play into the deck, and just speak to these cards a bit?
Tony, you want to talk about?
Well, I think a lot of folks don't give the deck quite enough credit as calling it glass cannon. I just saw a thread on Facebook the other day about what's the best glass cannon deck, and they said, well, Godo was a lot of people's answers. But you're just going to try and go off, and if you lose, you lose, and there's no recovery from it. There's no way to protect it. You just have to get your 11 mana and go. And that's a pretty big mischaracterization, because we do have options available to us to where we can protect our win. We have plenty of counterspell options that, to the point that we don't play them all. If we're really worried about a super blue meta, there's plenty of tech that you can put in there. Defense Grid is an amazing card for stealing that win. Where for an extra 2 mana, when everyone says, "Oh, okay, we don't have to," I've got my interaction, so we don't have to worry about Godo this turn. Well, drop a Treasonous Ogre with a Defense Grid, and you've just won that game in a lot of situations. And that can be searched up with the new Goblin from the Master set. Gosh, I guess it's not new anymore. Engineer. So we do have a lot of options at our disposal for protection.
One thing I think people
more than you might think.
One thing I think people might not appreciate about Defense Grid is that it is one of the few pieces in mono red that actually protects against not only the blue kind of counter spells, but also the dangerous swords to plowshares or swords to plowshares or like force of vigor, nature's claim, that sort of deal.
Chain of vapor.
So it unlike something like a like a pyroblast, which can only answer your counter spells, your chain of vapors or whatnot. Defense grid really is kind of a universal answer, so long as they can't pay for it, obviously. And Conqueror's Flail falls in a similar boat where you can play that in. You can pay the 2 mana upfront, and then you can also play the equip cost upfront if you have the time. Just something to do with your mana. That's
and
extra.
It's also searchable from Godo as well. So if you're sitting on tons of mana, but you have to fight through interaction, you can search it up with Godo and pass turn, and they have to answer it. If they don't answer the flail, then there's a problem there for them. If they answer Godo, oftentimes you can recast and go again because you haven't put Helm in danger.
It also gives you something to do
options.
if you have that hand where you draw a Panharmonicon, but you also draw like a Twin Flame or a Heat Shimmer. So you can like play Panharmonicon, and then the next turn you have like 8 mana. You're like, I play Godo, you get Hammer of Nazan and Conqueror's Flail, and then you hit him with a Twin Flame, and then you get your Helm of the Host off the second trigger. But like they have to answer the Conqueror's Flail when it enters, and it enters and immediately attaches, so they have like one chance to destroy it. And if that's the only destruction spell that people have, you win.
Yeah, and one thing about Conqueror's Flail is it's a lot like a Grand Abolisher, where it's okay to kind of play your own Grand Abolisher and then pass the turn, and because it's not going to prevent you're not providing protection for your opponents to combo. So it's not like a Dozan or a 3 mana Teferi, where you're basically, if you play that and then pass the turn, the next player can combo off basically with impunity. So Flail is nice in that regard, whereas Defense Grid requires a bit more
defense
caution.
Grid is
playing a Defense Grid and then passing can
Defense
be
Grid is usually
risky.
played on the turn where you combo off. I've done it the other way and succeeded with it. I've also done it the other way and failed with it. Sometimes if it's your only option, you do just jam a Defense Grid and hope the best. Hope that other people just don't quite have it yet. Occasionally.
Looking at the table is so important there to know whether you can just jam a Defense Grid, because you have to know what are the decks that are untapping in what order after I play this. Are they going to keep each other in check? And that's one of the things that I think is going to separate new cEDH players from experienced cEDH players, regardless of whether they're new with this deck, being able to read the table in that way.
So do you guys want to speak to fork effects before we get into the more controversial
fork effects, they only really work against counterspells. You have to play them on the turn. They also cost triple red, which triple red is not what our deck is generally aiming to produce. So the mana base, I guess.
So and by just triple red, to clarify, Nick means Godo the red and then the 2 red for the forks.
One other thing to discuss here that we actually didn't put on the list. One of the things to discuss here would be dual caster mage. Some people like that as a backup win con, because it combos with Twin Flame and Heat Shimmer. But the problem is that it's not particularly useful as a fork effect that costs 3 mana. If you're adding 3 mana to your combo, you're not really going to be able to do that. So it's not really protection. It's just a random card that might combo with a couple of other cards in the deck. So we've decided through testing and whatnot that it's not really worth running.
And then finally, let's talk about Slow Bad. So let's give Azurel the chance to defend why he thinks Slow Bad is worth including. And just, I think some of these effects are kind of more or less known to people. But Slow Bad is for 1 and a red. He's a 1/1 goblin creature, and you can sacrifice an artifact to give another target artifact indestructible until end of turn. And so take it away, Azurel.
Well, I admit I wasn't always on Slow Bad. I believe this year I started playing him more. I think now with Flash gone and the metas, on average, tending to be more grindy and more green based. Slowbad is just very simple protection for Helm and some of our other important artifact pieces. We can also search it with Imperial Recruiter, and other builds have a Goblin Matron. It's akin to Goblin Welder, except it doesn't need to wait a turn to activate. And I think it's definitely something most lists should pick up.
Okay. And the argument against, Nick, Tony, what do you have to say?
I think in that slot we're kind of running Goblin Matron at the moment, and I think because Goblin Matron can search up. If you wanted to have that sort of protection, you can go Goblin Matron into Goblin Engineer and grab a welding jar, but it would cost more mana. Obviously, you could also obviously grab Slowbad if you were also playing Slowbad. But Matron also gives us Dockside. It gives us Crater Maker. I think in the current meta, we're maybe thinking about swapping those cards, but I think the cards that we're aiming to put in would be like more interaction, more Wraths, things like that, I think. Slowbud, I think he's okay. He's just, if you're putting more Wraths in as well, like he becomes worse. Like when you play the 3-mana Wrath that kills everything, like Slowbud dies. So I don't know. He limits your plays a little bit. If you want to play him, then you can't run as many Wraths. And I think Wraths are really good in the current meta. You can run them, but then you're going to have anti-synergies in your deck. Compare him to like Welding Jar, he's just way worse. And I guess that shouldn't be a count against him because Welding Jar is amazing. But what do you think, Tony?
I mean, some of our other creatures are also Dido, like the wipes, so I don't think it's a complete fair estimation. It's also just like, it'd be more like cutting like a non-creature spell, maybe like Curse Totem, for example. It would be another body for Conqueror's Flail as well.
It's true. Yeah, I don't think it's not a bad card. That's not my point at all. It's definitely still a good card, and if your meta has a lot of green in it, it's definitely a card you should consider running.
It's not bad. It's been in early lists, but my thought is just, how happy am I seeing that in my opening 7? How likely am I to put that on the bottom if I have to go to 6? I think neither of those answers bode well for Slowbad.
Fair enough. Okay, next category is on recovery cards, and we've got here Codex Shredder, Trash for Treasure, Duretti, and Underworld Breach. So Codex Shredder, Duretti, more or less standard in builds. Trash for Treasure also comes in and out of lists, and then Underworld Breach is more about why. When that came out, people thought slam dunk and Godo. Obviously, this card is insane in so many decks. This card acts as a good recovery piece. Why should we not be playing Underworld Breach? Or maybe why should we? So
we shouldn't, because we're red and we don't get to tutor very well. Honestly, that's the biggest answer. Like, yeah, it does crazy shenanigans when you get it with LED and Wheel of Fortune. How often are you going to get those 3 cards in your opening 7? So we're not able to, and that's sort of the similar slam that we had against the Copy Wizard, right? Is we're not going to be playing that combo just because it combos. We can't reliably find it, and we don't get the same kind of value out of Breach that the decks that can find and abuse it can.
I think the strongest and kind of most uncontroversial recovery pieces that are seeing play in Godo are the lands. I think that's Buried Ruin and Sequestered Stash.
And Welder. Goblin Welder.
And then Welder, of course, is a very strong piece that's also findable with Imperial Recruiter. So the lands are findable with Expedition Map, sorry. Map. So though you can find them with Map, and then Welder is findable with Recruiter and Matron if you're running it. So those are pretty accessible. But then, as you pointed out, Breach, not really findable.
We also aren't on any fetch lands, which help feed Breach. So that also makes it weaker for us.
Yeah, fetch lands can interact with really badly with the most powerful card in the deck, which is Treasonous Ogre. Because the moment you pay 1 life, you've just reduced your mana that you can produce by 1. which the most mana that you can produce with him is 13. And when you can only produce 12, it means that you count to 11 and you don't have 2 mana left over for a defense grid, or a Chalice of the Void on one, or there's a bunch of stuff that you can get into play, and reducing that mana by 1 is actually relevant. Like 1 life lost in a Godo deck can slow you down a bit.
It's a big deal.
Remove your ability to interact. Yep.
So what about the other recovery pieces? I know I've been kind of a proponent against Codex Shredder. Do you guys want to defend?
I'll fight you on that one.
You guys are staunch advocates for it. Let's hear it. Let's hear it.
I don't know about the other two, but I'm a staunch advocate for Codex Shredder. When I first was experimenting with Shredder in the deck, I was thinking, this is kind of cool. We get to have a cheap recovery piece. We can play it now, use it when we need to. And oh, by the way, it kind of has a stacks effect, so it's not completely dead. I think it's a stacks card with a recovery bonus. I don't know if that falls under hot takes, but to be able to shut down top deck tutors and really change the way some people's combos can play out, I think that's huge.
A strange effect on
and by the
gameplay.
way, it gets Helm back.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, it makes it like, who wants to go first with top deck tutors? Like, do you want to go first and like risk losing my top deck tutor, or let somebody else do it and have them lose their, force somebody else to activate, make you activate the Codex Shredder, and then you can use your.
It interacts really well with like multicolor decks that are running 3 or more top deck tutors. Usually, black decks are running at least 2+. Then there's the Mystical Tutor and Worldly Tutor, and all of those. Limdul's Vault also. I've screwed over a Limdul's Vault player. It's kind of funny. You can mess up with Sensei's Divining Top players as well when they're topping, and then you just like mill 1, and this becomes a head games. It's kind of fun. Also, you can tutor it up with Goblin Engineer.
Inventor's Fair.
Yeah, Inventor's Fair can tutor it up. Both of those can also go for a recovery line through Expedition Map Bury Ruin as well for a similar amount of mana. But there are situations where where Codex Shredder can be the better line there rather than that. For example, if you have a land drop, a different land drop, it's cheaper to go for Codex Shredder.
And what about Duretti and Trash for Treasure? These cards are fairly similar, and I know there's been talk about maybe cutting these from the list.
Yeah, Duretti's fallen in and out of the list a few times. He's not like particularly cost efficient, but he can grab Helm back from the grave and put it back into play immediately. And he also, when you don't need to get Helm back, he does something. He filters and gets you more power by getting rid of superfluous lands you've drawn, or even better, getting rid of stacks pieces that don't particularly work in the matchup that you're in. You can toss them away and draw more gas or different stacks pieces or more interaction or protection. Trash for Treasure, I think, is just a bit more narrow, even though it's more efficient. You don't have that whole second aspect of being able to filter and loot for stuff.
So far, I've leaned a little more towards Trash for Treasure. Actually, I've had 2 games so far, notably, that it's been relevant, being 1 less. And like my most recent game, I had a hand with Hammer Nizan, and it got wheeled away, and I drew into Trash for Treasure, and I could make exactly 9 mana on 1 turn, and there was a known like Jaliva with Ad Nauseam, and somebody had just gone off. We stopped them, and I couldn't stop the Jaliva, so I had to try and go off. And then I saw this Trash for Treasure line, and it gave me exactly the amount of mana to try and go off. Now, they had interaction to stop me, unfortunately, but it was one of those games where just being 1 less has been relevant. I'm sure we have a lot of mana in our deck, so it's usually not too big a deal being 1 difference, but I am leaning a little bit off of Duretti recently.
And I guess one thing before we close out this category is, how many recovery pieces is optimal, do you think?
Kind of run all the best ones.
That's a hard question to answer. It really is.
The land slots are pretty free. So if we're talking about non-land recovery slots, I'd say like 2 or 3.
I think Trash for Treasure, for me, is another reason not to run Slow Bad, because I think Trash for Treasure is better than Slow Bad. Obviously, Azurel, as he just discussed, is using both. So, if he wants more protection, then yeah. But I think I would run Trash for Treasure over Slow Bat, I think.
Well, the thing
Can I
is
just jump in
that-
here? I wanted to mention real quick the 3 versus 4 mana. 4 is an interesting number in this deck for a 4-drop. And I know in cEDH in general, for a 4-drop, it has to be really friggin' good. Well, we can get away with some higher CMC cards. But I wanted to compare the difference in 3 and 4 between Trash for Treasure and Duretti, which is a later game card, and the 4 mana of Stranglehold, which is an amazing stacks piece that I don't really love. Because 4 mana comes down too late for what it wants its ability to be. I know that's kind of a tangent, but I get to voice that opinion if Stranglehold isn't as good as people think they are, so I'm going to take that
better card than
opportunity.
Stranglehold in the early game, because you can drop it turn 1 and stop them from being able to Imperial Seal for their win con immediately. And then they just don't. Their hand doesn't do anything. I mean, if they've got Demonic Tutor, then it doesn't work. But if they've got Demonic Tutor, they're probably going to play it before you play Stranglehold anyway. Stranglehold's still good though. You can still turbo it out, and it can still be amazing. But you're not going to drop it before turn 2 most of the time.
So the next category we have is interaction and removal / wraths. So here we've got a bunch of cards that I'm going to kind of list into different categories. So we've got the large wraths. So these are cards like Blasphemous Act and Chain Reaction, where you're going to clear everything up to including like Get Rog Monster. The one of the most popular like 6/6s, or I guess maybe like an Urza like big construct or something. So those are the top end of wraths. On the bottom end, we've got Pyroclasms, which are notoriously seen in Sunscreen decks.
Well.
And then we've kind of got the middle of the road wraths, which are Sweltering Suns, Anger of the Gods, Fiery Confluence, and then finally we have single target removal. So Thunderclap. I guess Pyrokinesis is kind of a weird category where it's a bit of a wrath / single target. And then outside of creatures, we have something like Mog Salvage. So I just want to kind of get people's, to take their temperature on how they feel about wraths and where the deck wants to be in terms of, big, medium, small, in the current climate or just in general. And then we can talk about some single target and stuff.
Tony, why don't you speak first on this?
Sure. Well, I think the new Drannith Magistrate has pushed our envelope for Raz. Pretty much Raz have to be and the targeted removal, but most of that already was 3 damage. But Raz kind of have to be 3 damage at this point. So I think most of the Pyroclasm effects are just kind of out. I think Raz are so important in this new meta that's sort of shaping up to be mid-range. There are so many dork decks around that you can just wreck with a well-placed Wrath. As a side note, Artifact Wraths don't see a lot of play in this deck much anymore. They're prone to the inopportune counterspell. I'm trying to Vandal Blast so that I can hit your Curse Totem that's keeping me from winning with my Treasonous Ogre, but it gets countered by the guy who didn't want his Sol Ring destroyed. Darn. So I'm less on Artifact. I think the Artifact spells should be targeted, but creature Raz are great.
So what about the difference between a Sweltering Suns or a Chain Reaction? I mean, 1 mana. I mean, maybe Sweltering Suns is the wrong example because that card also has a cycling mode, which is really nice. So let's talk about like Anger of the Gods versus something like a Chain Reaction. You think the ability to deal 3 damage versus up to 10 or
it could be
however
10.
much
It could also
damage
be
and kill,
it could also be
kill
2.
bigger commanders.
Chain Reaction's probably going to be 3
Yeah.
or more. I kind of maybe like Fiery Confluence over Chain Reaction just because it's a little bit more versatile. Even though you can't go above 3 with it, it does. 3 is kind of the magic number. It hits all the stack spaces that stop us. You get more value out of going higher sometimes. Obviously, Get Rog and Urza and some other stuff you can hit. I'm a big proponent of Blasphemous Act because I play in in paper anyway. I play in a meta where you could have a cEDH deck at the table, another cEDH deck at the table, but also a couple of high power decks that are like trying the beatdown strategy. And in that case, you fail your first attempt, you actually may just get beaten down before you get a chance to go again. But if you've got a Blasphemous Act, you can reset and slow people down enough to be able to have another attempt to go off. Chain Reaction could fit in there.
Okay.
I love Volcanic Fallout.
I want to toss out
Go on.
I want to toss out a weird one here that I actually am looking at on my desk at this moment. I just got it in the mail. Is Starstorm, which somebody pointed out in the Red Love Discord. I'm really curious to see how that goes. I'm a big proponent of instant speed interaction, even in this mono red deck. So Anger of the Gods is just great. I'm gonna play it. It's one of the best Raz we can get. But I'm really curious to see if this will perform. The ability for the deck to say, "Oh gosh, I'm out of it," and everyone believes you, because everyone counts Godo out. You know, oh, there's an oof at the table. I guess Godo's out of it. What's he gonna do? He can't use his artifacts. Well, if you can instant speed kill that, or the Magistrate, or the whatever that's keeping you from going off on the end step, a lot of times you can sneak in that win when other people shouldn't have tapped out but did.
What about the like earthquake type effects, the ones that scale, so you can either drop an early one CMC Wrath to clear a bunch of dorks, or scale it up all the way up to like a Draenith Magistrate for X's3.
I think what Tony was just saying is accurate. I think Starstorm is probably the best one of those, because it's also got that cycling ability. But then there's another more recent one printed. I forget what it's called, but it's essentially Starstorm without the cycling ability, but it also hits Planeswalkers, I think. So not strictly Starstorm isn't strictly better, but it's close to strictly better.
Okay, and then finally we've got some single target removal that's persisted in the list, namely Thunderclap. Do you want to justify that card, because it seems pretty strange to someone who hasn't looked at Godo much in the past?
I can justify it in 2 words: Aven Mind Sensor.
It's free. It's a free lightning bolt. Like,
Hell yeah, brother.
you can't hit a player with it, but it's a free lightning bolt. You're throwing away a land, but if you're comboing off immediately, like the deck has lots of mana. Losing one mountain, not the worst. And being able to stop Aven Mind Sensor, another instant speed stuff. I think Hushwinger? No, I think it's just Mind Sensor to be really worried about. But Thunderclap is really good against Mind Sensor. But also late end of turn, you can just pay 3 mana. It's not terribly overcosted for an end of turn interaction spell either.
And every once in a while, you have to sack the mountain to kill the Najeela that nobody expected to pop off this turn. But it can do it.
Good point.
I guess just talking about like a couple of other Windmill Slam things. We've also got like Abrade and Chaos Warp. I guess Chaos Warp is something that people may not like, but it costs 3 mana all the time. But it also does just answer everything, including those weird enchantments that you see once in a blue moon, but you need to get rid of.
One thing I wanted to add to this list that I'm going to test out for this upcoming Tri-cEDH tournament is Fry. I definitely want to try that out, because now it's another thing that's uncounterable that hits Draenith. Uncounterability is slightly relevant because a lot of times other people aren't going to win. They'll defend other people's stacks pieces. So like being able to kill Draenith, Ashiok, even Mind Sensors, as well as some like important blue or white commanders. That's something I definitely want to look forward to trying out.
Yeah, I think my
Interesting.
But hitting the new Teferi
I
is
think has
relevant
gotten
as
better
well.
with the printing of Draenith. It still kind of fails my removal criteria because it doesn't hit Oof, Oof is a real problem to play against. Like, we can combo through it, but not easily.
Yeah.
So I kind of want all my instant speed interaction to be able to hit Oof. Because it's pretty common.
Okay.
I mean, even now, even after you've got Draenith and other stuff to destroy as well, but I think Oof is also.
I tell you what, if you're out there and you want to start a fight and waste several hours of my life, just come onto the Red Love Discord and say, I think insert card here is the best removal spell in Godo. And someone will argue.
So moving on to one of the more interesting categories, and I think that is stacks. many people, I think, have the strange notion that Godo is just a turbo all-in combo deck, when actually it gets to run some very, very strong stacks pieces, and it gets to run, quite a few of them. So just to go through some of the strong lists, strong cards. We're not going to discuss too much, but like Blood Moon, Magus of the Moon, Chalice of the Void. You get to put a Chalice of the Void on one.
Chalice, man.
That's insane. Stranglehold, Trinisphere, which seems strange, but again, most of this deck is permanent based ramp, not too many low CMC spells. So very, very strong effects you get to run, and then some more that we'll be touching on. So Curse Totem is one that the deck can also run, and the guys here have some thoughts on that about whether or not this card is worth it. And then Possibility Storm as well. Very, very strong stacks piece if you can resolve it, but there's a bit of liability associated with Possibility Storm now that Drannith is out. So let's talk about the Curse Totem and Possibility Storm first, and then we've got some other pieces to briefly cover that are being considered. So let's start with this Curse Totem. I think you guys brought up Vandal Blasting your opponent's Curse Totem, which seems weird in a deck that doesn't run Dorks, that you'd be wanting to remove a Curse Totem. So why are we not? Why are you guys considering cutting Curse Totem?
So Curse Totem does.
There's like 4 cards. There's 4 cards that make this deck competitive. It'd be good otherwise, but there's 4 cards that make it competitive. Godo, Helm of the Host, Hammer of Nazan, and Treasonous Ogre. And Treasonous Ogre gets shut off by Curse Totem. It is the probably besides Helm and Godo, the best card in the deck. Because it gets you there right away. Shutting that off is
the counter to that is, if you have Curse Totem and Ogre in the same hand, you just don't play the Curse Totem. You just play the Ogre. The problem is when you play the Curse Totem and then you draw Ogre. That does happen, and it sucks.
Yep.
It's why Vandal Blast actually hasn't been in the deck for a long time, because you can't target your own permanents with it. Whereas something like Shattering Spree was played for a long time, when we were worried about null rods and things like that a lot. It was a lot better because you could blow up your own Curse Totem with it if you needed to in a pinch. But Curse Totem is also so good at killing your opponent's mana dorks and messing up your opponent's combos, and it just generally is just very good. I think it's less good than it used to be, and it might.
I think the other side to it is, now that we're running more wipes and interaction, we can have more answers to deal with dorks and creatures in general. And Curse Totem, we want to play it as early as possible when we see it. And shutting off, obviously there's Ogre, but also like Brass Squire is a pretty good cost reducer. And then other important recovery pieces like Goblin
Metal
Welder, Goblin Engineer. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's more of a meta call now.
Fair enough. And I guess one thing too is that you can always just, if you want to hate on mana dorks, you can always just replace Curse Totem with another Wrath.
Totally. But Wrath also kill,
and you're not going to interfere
Wrath's also
with
kill your Metalworker. So there's that.
Yeah, fair enough. But you don't run into the Treasonous Ogre problem. And so the next one was Possibility Storm, which for people who might not be aware why it's a good stacks piece in this deck, if you're casting a spell from your hand, you exile the cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card that shares a type with it, and then you cast that card without paying its mana cost instead. So that doesn't actually interfere with you casting your commander from the command zone. So basically, you slam a Possibility Storm, you can cast Godo, find Helm the Host, and then sometimes you can just wait a full turn cycle to just pay the mana to equip Helm and combo off without ever triggering the Possibility Storm. And it makes it very difficult for your opponents to tutor or do anything proactive when they're basically just blind flipping through their deck. Now, the problem with Possibility Storm, the reason why we want to discuss it a bit is that, or at least bring it up for the listeners, there's a new sort of liability in playing Possibility Storm, and that is with Drannith Magistrate. So Drannith reads you can't cast cards from that aren't in your hand. So with Possibility Storm exiling the cards that you're casting, you then can't cast those cards from exile. So if your opponent has a Draenith Magistrate, you need to be very cautious about playing a Possibility Storm. Otherwise, you will lock yourself out of the game and basically hand the Draenith player the win. And then even if you're cautious about that, your opponent's playing creatures and maybe blind flipping into Draenith is a bit of a concern as well. Yeah, that's the thing about Possibility Storm. And then we've got some other fringe stacks pieces that, or I guess, yeah, stacks or interference that get run. One thing that was being discussed on the server not too long ago was Ruination and From the Ashes. Do you guys want to talk about those? Kind of in line with like the Blood Moon, non-basic hate idea.
Yeah, I think with Tainted Pact decks being really common, I think From the Ashes is getting to the point where it's quite good. If they're not running basics in their deck, or even if they are running a couple basics, but they're not necessarily the colors they need, that can be backbreaking. Ruination, I feel like, at least in the primer and the list that I think Azurel's maybe running as well, it doesn't really fit very well because we use a lot of non-basics in the deck to build up. There's obviously soul lands, but there's also a lot of utility lands that have, marginal upsides, but they're worth running over a mountain because we don't really need that much red mana. So the deck runs a lot of basics, like 18 or something, but at the same time, you don't want to be running, 2 of your lands under the bus when you draw Ruination, and usually, half the lands in the deck, or almost half the lands in the deck, are non-basics. So if you're casting Ruination, there's a good chance you're going to be blowing up one of your own lands as well.
Yeah, I think From the Ashes is a really, really cute idea. And so for those people who don't know, it's basically a Ruination, but for each land destroyed, its owner can search their library for a basic land.
From the Ashes also play. An interesting thing as well. It puts the lands into play untapped. So you can actually produce mana with it if you have enough non-basics. We're talking very late game, but if you have like 5 non-basics, you tap them all for mana, you play From the Ashes, you sack all your non-basics, you end up with a bunch of untapped basics. So it can be.
It's also just nice we're weaving into a turn, right? You're not spending your entire turn just blowing up the lands. You can From the Ashes and then recover some mana and then follow it up with maybe like a cheap 2 mana play or something.
A card
very, very
that may
interesting
well
card.
Find its way into the primer soon.
Something else I'd point out about it too is that when you Blood Moon, non-basics are still non-basics. They're mountains, but they're non-basic mountains. So that's worth pointing out. And I think these are good, solid cards that are definitely worth consideration in any meta. The primer we tried to write for a generic unknown meta to the best of our ability. So if you have specific meta where this card or that card is going to be slightly better here than it would be in a general meta, there's a lot of those card considerations in the primer. So I would go check it out. There's a huge long list of cards that are really powerful, worth consideration, didn't quite make the cut, and we try to discuss some of the pros and cons of that.
Big honorable mentions section.
And our last 2 stacks pieces are a bit out there, and these are God-Pharaoh Statue and Ward of Bones, and these are 6-drop artifacts. Now, God-Pharaoh Statue is basically 2 sphere resistances stapled together, but it's also asymmetrical. So spells your opponents cast cost 2 generic mana more to play, and then you've got Ward of Bones, where if your opponent can't play a it's artifact, enchantment, land, or creature if they would then have control more of those permanents than you. In more or less words, there's some more things going on there. But yeah, the idea, I guess, with Ward of Bones is that you can, as a creature light deck and an enchantment light deck, you can lock your opponents out of playing those important permanent types. Then God-Pharaoh Statue just running severe interference. So what are your thoughts on these cards? Have you guys tested
with God-Pharaoh Statue quite a lot. I really like it. It does cost a little much, but the deck is designed to get 6 mana out pretty reliably quickly. You definitely don't want to be playing a list that has a lot of rituals in it if you're playing God-Pharaoh Statue, because you don't want to be ritualing this out and then not have the mana to combo off. But at the same time, it's very backbreaking against a lot of decks if you can land it turn 3 or 4. It's also hilariously funny with Possibility Storm because they have to pay 2 for both spells, which is really funny. So paying 4 extra for each of your spells, pretty brutal.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
like
Trinisphere works with
as well.
Possibility Storm as well.
Or Trinisphere with Storm, yeah. And Ward of Bones, I guess you haven't tested with it.
I think it'd be really
worth
good
looking
against a really heavy creature meta. Maybe cut a few of the creatures from the deck and run Ward of Bones. Could be really good. Also, maybe run it against someone who's running lots of enchantments in a stacks deck or something. They're just not able to play their stacks pieces.
Yeah, I think the idea of kind of shutting your opponents off even being able to cast creatures, so they can't play their commanders or they can't play a Thassa's Oracle, potentially has some good strength, but being 6 mana and is again pretty rough. Okay, and so we're just about through the woods on the single card discussion. We've got a brief category, or I guess 2 brief categories, and then we're going to move on. So the next category is called Grind. So here we have cards like Reforge the Soul, Memory Jar, Anji's Ravagers, Sword of Fire and Ice, Ignite the Future, Stolen Strategy. And if you guys want to know what these cards do, look them up. There's a lot of them. But we're not gonna be getting into the discussion of these individual cards. More or less going to be talking about the idea of grind and should the Godo deck be designed to go into longer games, and how much should you consider that kind of effect? Tony, Azrael, insert. Go, one of you guys.
Yeah, I don't think that's the game we want to be playing. We're not as good at that as other decks are. So why lean into strategies that we can't excel at? The stacks pieces that we play are absurdly powerful stacks pieces. The fast mana that we play is the best fast mana we can get our hands on to get to that combo before anybody has a chance to blink, let alone react to it. Playing this sort of grindy mid-range game on value engines is, in my opinion, the wrong way to go. Not that any one of these cards is bad. I don't think that's the right strategy.
I think there's a place for it. Someone who was since we first got Helm, and like I was always playing a slower, more grindy Godo. I think there's a place. It's just like none of these cards are perfect compared to like Sylvan Library or Dark Confidant. So there's not like straight up like draw a card per turn. They have like weird stipulations. There's a place for maybe some type of build that's grindier now that the meta has changed. Maybe with something like Mystic Forge if we get more cards later on. Stolen Strategy has been a little bit hit or miss depending on the pod. So I think there's a place for it, just not the best place right now.
Yeah. Reforge, and
Okay.
I think Reforge is probably my favorite card on this list that you said. Reforge the Soul, just because late game, if you're in a bad place, you can just be like top deck it and be like, pay 2 mana, I have a new hand of cards, I can go for it now. Problem is you're giving everyone else a new hand of cards, and while Memory Jar might not give them a permanent hand of cards, it gives you a hand of cards on the turn when you're going to be wanting to use those cards to go off, and it gives everybody else a new hand of cards right then as well. And it actually gives them cards that they want to use, because they're not going to get value out of them later. Sword of Fire and Ice actually has a negative synergy with the deck in that you can, if you play Godo and you get Sword of Fire and Ice just to have value and blow up your opponent's creatures and draw cards, it's great. But if you then, like the best scenario for doing that would be to then hit Godo with like Twin Flame and equip a Helm afterwards. But you can't do that because it gives pro red. Otherwise, I think Sophie would be amazing because you could just play Godo. If every time you draw Twin Flame or Heat Shimmer, you could just play Godo, get the other one, get the Sophie, equip it, attack, and then the next turn like Twin Flame in for the win. But you can kind of do that with Umezawa's Jitty, which I think is better than Sophie, just because of that. It gives you that option of just play Godo, get Jitty, equip, attack, and then later Twin Flame him. You run the risk that someone counters Twin Flame, and then you just get kind of locked out of the game, though. So it's Ignite the Future, Stolen Strat. I don't really have much to say. I just think they're slightly subpar versions of other cards that other decks get to run that are efficient, and they're not that efficient.
Someday Wizards will mess up and print a card that's a good enough value engine that will run it. I don't think we're quite there.
Okay, so our final category is meta tech, and just a few cards that are pretty quick to comment on. So Command Beacon, why is that meta tech? This is actually a card that I know Gitrog lists were running for a long time because if you're playing an expensive commander, you can bypass commander tax later on, and that's actually what people might think it's for in Godo, but actually it's not. So why are Godo decks now running Command Beacon?
Command Beacon,
absolutely,
yeah,
and. I like that you pointed out that it's not for the commander tax, because honestly, if I get to play Godo and I get stopped, I get stopped. If I play Godo a second time and I don't win, I'm probably not going to get to try a third time. And oftentimes, by the time I'm casting it a second time, I do win. If you let me get to it a second time, that's usually when I'll take that win.
I won on third attempts before, but it's usually when Helm got blown up and then I get the Helm back from the graveyard or something. I think casting Godo 3 times doesn't usually work.
Yeah.
I think the last time I did that was maybe when Paradox Engine was still legal and you could abuse the shit out of it in Godo.
Yeah, but I think that's important for people who might not be aware. But Command Beacon actually is a way to get around Draneth by putting your commander into your hand and casting it from your hand. So notably, Command Beacon also searchable with Expedition Map. So
technically,
there's a few ways to find
it's searchable with Goblin Engineer via Expedition Map, and therefore it's also searchable via Goblin Matron. So.
And Imperial Recruiter. Yeah, there's a lot of weird jank tutor lines in Godo. Some cards are accessible through very long tutor chains, but they are technically accessible. Next up, we have Silent Arbiter, which is something that Azurel, you play. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll definitely admit this is more of a meta pick, and some of the decks it does help against are fairly common enough. So it's mostly versus like Najeela, Tymna X decks, and Yuriko, and I guess any decks that are still running like any Kiki combos. This is something I've been trying to play and test out. It's fairly easy to get it out, at least by turn 3. We have a lot of 2-mana rocks to ramp it out if we don't need to win yet. It also preserves our life total for Treason Soger. And sometimes it's awkward in hands where we want to win turn 2, but otherwise it hasn't really been anything crazy. It's another body for Conqueror's Flail.
Okay, and the last card on this list is one that I'm particularly fond of and I shell all the time on the Mono Red server, and that's the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. And it's under the Metatech category, not the Stacks category. Because I guess you guys can speak to this.
I don't want to skip my land drop.
I kind of want to hear you, actually, because I know you've been an evangelist of the Tabernacle, so I kind of want to hear what you have to say on it. Sell me on it.
Okay, so my opinion on Tabernacle is that it's almost like a 0-mana curse totem that doesn't interfere with your with your combo. It doesn't interfere with Treasonous Ogre. So you are taking up a land drop, and the unfortunate thing is that if you're trying to land it early, it is almost like you're time walking yourself. But you are also impacting your opponent. So if everyone, let's say, goes, I mean, this is a very simplistic pod, but imagine your opponent's going turn 1 dork, turn 1 dork, turn 1 dork, and you slam Tabernacle. They have to commit to tapping their dork to pay for it. So you are getting that effect, but now you're behind a land drop. So it's usually not something that I like doing, turn 1, especially because when a deck is trying to do, land, then land, and 2 CMC rock. So this is something I usually like to drop around turn 2, turn 3, and really punish people who have extended, turn 1 dork into turn 2 creature, or, another dork and a creature or something like that, where they've committed their resources to play, and they're either going to be, paying these tax and tapping things down, or, sacrificing it to make their plays. So it's it's a pretty low cost thing to run. At least that's just my opinion. I've had great success running Tabernacle in different decks. So yeah.
The reason I don't like it too much is it's pretty awkward again with Blood Moons and Magus of the Moon. It's also usually considered more of like a spell slot than a land slot. So for now I'm like at 32 lands, and I've tried cutting down to 31 and it was fine. So you could possibly convince me to do that. But I don't know. It's just you want it to be on, and then it's off with Blood Moons, and Blood Moons are really
terrible.
good right now.
I think when you're at a table and
it's like
even if like two people have mana dorks and you play this, you've essentially locked out one of your own mana dorks, right? Because you just sacrificed a land drop, right? That could have been a mountain. And it's not necessarily that you don't have more lands in your hand either. You have to play that as a land drop. You know, I'm reducing my mana by 1, and I'm reducing my opponent's mana probably by 1 or maybe 2 if they're playing dorks. But not all decks are playing dorks, so the third deck that isn't playing dorks is now the winner in this scenario, not you. I would rather, since it's a spell slot, I would rather just run an extra Wrath. I think an extra Wrath just makes more sense than Tabernacle. Fiery Confluence.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's one thing that's been a common trend throughout these single card discussions is just run another Wrath.
And I wish we could run like 3 more Wraths, but there's only so many slots in the deck. And
the Tabernacle isn't going to remove a Drannith Magistrate, or at least it really shouldn't, because your opponents should be paying for that. But you know what?
It's also $2,000 more than I want to spend on another Wrath.
That wraps it up for our discussion on single cards. We're going to move on to mulligans and some how to play some of these hands. So we've got some complicated sample hands. So these aren't trivial where new players might make some basic mistakes, and we can talk about these a bit. So before we get into that, the sort of listener question that's related to this, and I know Nick, you had something you wanted to mention about, and that is, what's a hurdle to get over when learning to play Godo? And that's Gappy who asked that.
Okay, so
Nick,
my answer is you need to get over keeping mediocre hands. I think a lot of other decks, when you're playing a lot of other decks, especially other cEDH decks, you want to keep your 7-card hand. In Godo, you don't care. You can win with a 3-card hand. And because of the London Mulligan, we get to abuse the crap out of it. You can mulligan to 4 in this deck and still win on turn 2. Pretty well. Like
you can mulligan in this deck to 3 and win on turn 1.
And
it's unlikely, but it can be done.
With the London Mulligan. Like I would mulligan to I've mulliganed to 3 and 1. I actually have mulligan to 3 and 1 before the London Mulligan, but that was just insanely lucky. I think with this deck, if you're looking at your first 7 and it's not amazing god tier, you're throwing it away. And if you're looking at your second 7 and it's not really good, you're throwing it away. And if you're looking at your 6 and it's like barely playable, you're probably throwing that away too. If you're looking at your 5 and it's playable, you're keeping it, but because you don't really want to go to 4. But you know, you need to mulligan aggressively with this deck, or not necessarily you need to, but you get to mulligan aggressively with this deck, whereas you can't with a lot of other decks.
Yeah, I think before we talk about some of these more complicated hands, we're just going to give an example of, close to the God hand, and that's this hand right here. So if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be seeing this on the screen. If you're just listening, here's what it is. So we've got 3 mountains, a Cavern of Souls, Mana Vault, Treasonous Ogre, and Wheel of Fortune. So this is a turn 2 win with a way to gas your hand back up afterwards, and you've also got some form of protection in the form of Cavern of Souls. So really,
and you can mulligan this hand to 3 and it's still playable. 3 and it's still a turn 2 win.
Yeah.
That's insane. So that's exactly what Nick was trying to say with you can go down very deep because there's some very strong cards that will allow you to win from almost no resources. But yeah, now to get into the complicated hands, and I'll read out the hand, and again the picture will be on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. And I want to get your guys' opinion on would you mull, would you keep, and how would you play the hand. So our first hand is Mountain, Crystal Vein, Sensei's Divining Top, Conqueror's Flail, Magnetic Theft, Imperial Recruiter, and Direfleet Daredevil. So keep or mull?
Depends.
I'm gonna keep.
Even on a first
I'm gonna
seven?
keep this hand more often than not. Second 7 for sure. I think I would be inclined to keep this hand as a first 7. There's time. Yeah, I would consider keeping this hand. I
think
don't hate it.
I'd mull if it was a second 7 as well. I think I'd keep this. I'd keep this at 6, and I'd keep this at 7.
So there's obviously some great cards in here, right?
You got 2 redundant cards, like Imperial Recruiter and Magnetic Theft are kind of doing the same thing in this hand. So to me, this is a 6-card hand anyway. So I can do better if I'm. And I think 6-card hands can do better than this. So I would mulligan the first 7.
And so
what I like about this hand is obviously there's a little bit of redundancy there, but both of those are win attempts. So dealing with either the ogre or the recruiter still gives you the ability to go off with cheap mana. But what I really like about this hand is actually top and Direfleet Daredevil. Gives you other things to do. So this hand has 2 lands in it. The top to get you your 3rd land that you're gonna need for sure. And it has essentially 3, maybe 4 different.
The thing I don't like about it is that there is a risk this hand goes nowhere when you play the top turn 1, you top the next turn, and there's no lands there. It's unlikely, I guess, statistically, but you're still almost 50-50, maybe not 50, 1/3 of the time this hand is going to go nowhere, regardless of whether it's a mulligan or not. I don't like that. I like to have a path to victory in the hand, I think. But I said I'd keep it on a 6 or a 5, because I'm throwing away probably Magnetic Theft, I think. Yeah.
That'd be the drop.
Our second hand here, we have 3 mountains, a Dwarven Ruins, Lion's Eye Diamond, Arcane Signet, and Honor-Worn Shaku. So what do you, first of all, keep or mull, and then how are you playing this hand?
It's an interesting hand. I think most new players to Godo would windmill slam this hand, but I think it's kind of bad. Unless you draw additional acceleration, you're not going to be winning. I mean, you've got 12 mana in the hand. But you're relying on Lion's Eye Diamond to get there. If you draw any interaction, you're not going to be using it. You're not going to be able to use it. You're also, that 11 mana only comes online on turn 4, which is not good. If you're mulliganing with this hand down to like 5 or 6, it's also not terribly good. Although, just having some mana, like I would keep this on like 6 or 5, just because like you can just, play a Dwarven Ruins, play an Arcane Signet, play an Honor-Worn Shaku. An Honor-Worn Shaku here, if you're not familiar with Godo, it taps for 3 mana, not 1, because both Godo and Helm of the Host can be tapped for mana using it on the combo turn to help equip the Helm of the Host. But I don't particularly like this hand. I'd keep it on a 5, probably 6 maybe.
So funny enough about this hand is that you're saying you're gonna mulligan it when and this is a common mistake new Godo players would make, because it is the meme of play Godo, count to 11 mana, right? And what you're saying is that even though you're fulfilling that basic meme, that's just
you're
not
using all the cards
not
in the
enough.
hand to do it though, and you don't have any other cards that you get to play, like a Blood Moon or keep a Red Blast up or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
And compare that to the hand we just looked at, where, yeah, it's a little bit sketchy. You need to get to that other land. There's a little bit of redundancy in there. But what else do you have? You have a little bit of card selection. You have 2 different tutors in there in the form of Imperial Recruiter and almost certainly Dire Fleet Daredevil. So even if you're stopped on your Ogre, well, we can get a Dockside if we need to for an additional mana rush. So there's a lot more options that you can just top deck something great and or use the cards in your hand to get there. Whereas the second hand is try it, and if you fail,
I mean,
you failed.
it's got some stuff going for it too, because like you are just gonna have mana development, which will help you if you draw into other gas, like a Panharmonicon or something like that. But I'm still not a huge fan.
But as you pointed out, it's a turn 4 hand, and with nothing else going for it, and you're going to ditch whatever you draw to the LED anyways. It's not there. I would mulligan this hand.
Second 7 probably as well.
On a first 7, on a second 7, probably on a 6.
Yeah.
I'd keep 5.
On our last hand here, we have a Blast Zone, Crystal Vein, Command Beacon, Mind Stone, Blood Moon, Brass Squire, and Red Elemental Blast. So keep, mull, and how would you play?
Easy mull.
It's rough because it doesn't have any red mana. Otherwise, it's.
I would definitely mull this away if it was my 7, any of my 7s. Maybe even my 6.
Yeah, it doesn't have. This deck does not reliably draw into red mana, guaranteed. I mean, you've got 18 mountains and stuff, but like you're only reliably sort of going to draw a mountain by. I guess, you know what? I take that back. I think reliably you're going to draw a mountain by turn 4. It's just not particularly fast, so I wouldn't keep it on the back of that. Like that you have to wait so many turns to reliably draw a mountain. Means that your Blood Moon's going to arrive a little late. You're probably not going to get to the double red to use the Red Blast to stop a counterspell on Godo, so what's the point of that Red Blast in your hand?
Well, you can get to the double red if you drop the moon, and the game goes in that longer direction. So maybe if you're sitting against some stacks decks, that's not a bad thing. If the
decks you're playing against aren't fast combo decks, this hand is kind of okay. And if Blood Moon's going to be very effective in the matchup, it's not terribly bad.
If you could keep this, if you believe that by your 4th land drop you get a red source, because you technically can go off turn 4 with this if you hit your red source with Brass Squire and casting, because you have 6 mana with the Crystal Vein.
You do.
At turn 4.
I think this hand is like.
So, depends on if you're feeling lucky enough at turn 4.
Probably keep this on a 6, and I'd throw out the Red Blast.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the other
Blood
decks
Moon's
at the table.
Be real good
this one's right on that line for me.
If it's a 5 hand, I'd keep it, and you like get rid of the blast.
That's okay too, because you've got a turn 4 win if you draw.
Yeah, probably so.
That's probably good enough.
Okay. Well, thank you for your advice on mulliganing, and we've got a few more things that we want to cover before we get to some final listener questions and close out the show. So, up next, we've got a few hot takes that you guys wanted to get off your chest and put out there to the community.
My favorite part, man. My favorite part.
So let's hear them. What are your hot takes? Justify them. Just get them out there.
This deck can win from nowhere, and that's the best thing about it. Like people that I play against, they say that they're terrified of Godo because you can win from nothing. You got nothing on the board. You played a mountain on turn 1, so you don't look aggressive, but then you just like win the next turn. And so they always have to expect you to be able to be going off, and that's really tough for a lot of decks to deal with, really stressful for them to play against. And they'll often underestimate you as well, because newer players against you will think, oh, he's got to count to 11. I can watch him count up slowly. No, you can't.
And that's true depending on the board state too. Is a lot of people write off the Godo player. Oh, there's a no rod on board. Godo can't win. Well, actually, out of nowhere, oftentimes you can. There's a lot of ways to get out from under that. And so, he got counterspelled once. Guess he's not going to win. The number of times that I've heard that is just we don't care about counterspells that much. It's just not that big a deal. We have a lot of answers to them, and when we get counterspelled, we just try again with 2 more mana. So there's so many ways that you can come out of left field with this deck and just A lot of people call it stealing the win, but hey, a dub's a dub, isn't it?
Godo gets countered.
Fair enough.
Like people go, oh, but what if Godo gets countered? Well, first of all, creature counters are the least common type of counters in cEDH. And second of all, if Godo gets countered, so what? I just have to pay 2 more mana next time. My deck is mostly mana.
Yeah. What's this? Who wrote down this next hot take here?
Oh yeah, this was. I think someone mentioned this, and it definitely resonates with me. They never expect you to have interaction, so you don't have to. Even if you do actually have interaction, people will play theirs before expecting you to have any, and they'll.
Oh yeah, people jump you in the turn order all the time and just be like, "Oh, I'll counter that."
You don't even
It's
have
like,
to pass
"Oh, great, now I
priority
don't have
most
to
of the
Pyro
time. The
Blast
guy
it."
after you will just say, "I've got a counter." Once the guy in front of
they'll
you
just
passes
jump it.
priority, the guy behind you is just like, "Shit, now I have to answer this." But like you actually had the interaction, and you probably would have cast it because there's maybe only one person left in the turn order. But you didn't even have to because they didn't expect you to have to. So you get to save that red blast for what you really want. Protect your win.
Okay, next up.
And they won't play
Yeah.
around it. They just won't play around it either. Like they'll just say, "Oh, okay, Godo's the
They
only
play
one left, so I guess I
Oracle, and
win
it
now."
gets-
Not expecting. We actually do run a lot of interaction.
Next take.
Yeah. So a lot of the stacks that you can run in this deck is unique. No other deck gets to play it. Trinisphere, Chalice of the Void, things like that. Nobody else is really running, and so people, 1, aren't building around it, and 2, you get to play some cool cards that nobody else is running. Possibility Storm. I mean, come on, who else runs Possibility Storm? It's amazing. And in a lot of cases, these cards can just be better than having blue counterspells. You don't have to keep mana up. You don't have to throw away your counterspells stopping people win. It's a little, I guess people throw around the word parasitic, that you're relying on other people having counter magic. But, if other people are countering other people's wins and you're not, then you're being able to use those cards for better effect for yourself. So being selfish is sometimes the way to go.
Regarding
Nice.
stacks, we also have someone wrote down this might be the best stacks deck in cEDH. So who wants to justify that one?
I forget who
Back that
said
one
this
up.
in the voice chat that we were having last night. Maybe it was Sage. I think it was
I think it
Sage
might be
Grass.
Ashwell.
He was in the
Oh.
chat last night, right? Maybe silly.
Or
I don't know.
Silly.
He was like, "Is it the best stack decks in cEDH?" I don't think so, but it gets to do something that other stacks decks don't have, which has a reliable way to close the game. Most stacks decks, you got your Urza stacks deck, which can lock down the game, but then, often you're just sitting there activating Urza, hoping to find one of your tutors or one of your win cons. Whereas Godo is like, oh, I've got the game locked down. Okay, I just win now.
I think it's one of the best decks with stacks elements that can translate going from like a slower game plan to suddenly you're trying to win next turn.
Yeah, it can capitalize on the board state faster than other stacks decks can.
Yeah, like playing a Possibility Storm locks everyone out, and then very easy for you to close the game from there. I think we covered this next hot take kind of in our last segment when we were talking about mulligans, and how frequently you guys were saying ship these hands. Maybe I'd keep this on my 6 or my 5, and that's that the London Mulligan is great with Godo. Maybe it's probably since Flash Hulk being gone, and even arguably with that deck around, probably the best London Mulliganing deck in cEDH. Or the deck that best takes advantage
I think
of it.
the answer to that is very
most.
simple. Our deck is highly variable in how powerful the cards are. So often hands are relying on a few very powerful cards to win the game, and the rest of the cards are either replaceable or entirely redundant. And so in that situation, why not just throw away a bunch of them? And when you can select your dream 4 from a hand of 7 every single time, then why not mulligan straight to 4 for a dream 4? There is the risk of mulliganing past that.
It also solves a problem for us. And that problem is Helm in hand. And I know I've run into this in chat rooms and Facebook and things where people say, "Oh, if you draw Helm, you can't win." No, you just search up Hammer of Nazan and then play the Helm. But that opens you up to non-creature counterspells, which is a really, really big deal. I think people underestimate how big a deal it is that we don't have to cast a non-creature spell as part of our combo. So Helm in hand is bad. It also opens it up to wheels. Dumping it in the graveyard. So being able to London Mull a 7-card hand that has Helm and just say, "Oh, let's put that on the bottom."
Mull to 6
feels
can be
good.
better than a 7-card keep. With a lot of hands that have Helm in them. Picking the other 6, if the other 6 are good and you have Helm, you can often have to throw it away if it's a 7. But if it's a 6 or a 5, you can keep it because you get to throw Helm to the bottom of the deck. And then, even better, you're guaranteed not to draw Helm.
Okay, so our last hot take here is a card. You guys really wanted to talk about it, so here's the floor. It's
please.
It's a brand new card coming out that was spoiled for M21.
Older than that.
And that is Frenzied Fugue.
No, this
actually
one's been out a little bit now, actually.
You just sort of discovered it.
Wait, really?
This was in one of the last Commander decks.
Wait, was it Commander 2020 or Commander 19?
Actually.
I thought this was a brand new card.
For us to notice.
Okay.
And
yeah, I've never seen this.
It was newly
card.
discovered.
The card is.
Here's my hot take. My hot take is that Frenzied Fugue is one of the most underrated red cards in cEDH.
Oh my god, this card is from Commander 2016.
Is it really?
How have I never seen this card before? Oh my god. I thought this was a brand new card. This is crazy. Okay, so I'm just going to read this card for everyone. So, when Frenzied Fugue enters the battlefield or at the beginning of your upkeep, gain control of enchanted permanent until end of turn because it's a enchantment aura. Untap that permanent, it gains haste until end of turn. Okay, so why are you guys obsessed with this 4-mana theft effect?
It's
so why don't you talk about the floor and then I'll talk about the ceiling?
Is so exactly what Godo wants, right? So this card, you can just steal someone's land, obviously for 1. So guaranteed you get 1 mana out of it. Most of the time you're going to be able to steal a Soul Ring or a Mana Crypt or an Ancient Tomb or something like that taps for 2. Occasionally you even get to steal like a Grim Monolith, which is even better because you tap it down, it doesn't untap for them, and then it untaps in your upkeep, so it just becomes a Thran Dynamo. So mana generation is it's pretty good at mana generation. Like obviously it's not as good as just running a Thran Dynamo because a Thran Dynamo is guaranteed to make 3 mana, but it's generally going to produce mana for you, which is generally the thing that your deck needs. It's usually going to produce 2 mana, which, as Azurel was talking about before, when your cards produce 2 mana, you're getting reasonably good value out of them, even if it is a bit slow at being a mana rock. And then Tony, go ahead.
Sure. So the floor of this is that it's mana, and it's not the best mana in the world, but the worst case scenario is it ramps you a little bit. The best case scenario, the sky's the limit. No, honestly, it's the versatility of the card which makes me love it so much. Plus, just that it's fun. But the fact that it can answer things that that's really hard for mono red to answer. For example, the Ashiok is a really hard card for us to deal with at 5 loyalty. Yeah, we can bolt it and then try to attack it with a goblin or something, but it makes it really hard for us to combo off with an Ashiok, and we don't easily deal with planeswalkers. An opposing Stranglehold, for example. Well, it's any of the asymmetric stacks effects. The new Drannith Magistrate is a good one. Well, let's just grab it, and then on our turns, we can combo off. So it answers a lot of things in a single card slot. Yeah, it's a little bit overcosted, but what you're paying for is the versatility to handle so many situations. And then you can get really crazy with things like, let's grab your Necropotence, for example.
Along the lines of the value, I will also add that Sylvan Library, because you gain control at the beginning of your upkeep, and Sylvan Library happens in your draw step. You can get a timeshare, I guess. I kind of think this card is like a timeshare, right? You're sharing it with your opponent. Yeah, it's
Carpet of Flowers. So
it's very versatile, that's for sure.
I personally have stolen a Grim Monolith with it, tapped the Grim Monolith for 3 mana, and then sacked it to my KCI to go off. So
Card Clan.
that feels real good. So this, I mean, there's definitely
That's
there's
Card Clan
options
Ironworks,
here.
for those not in the know.
Yeah, and then so our final category before some remaining listener questions is piloting advice. So just a couple short little bits that you might want to talk about, and maybe some aphorisms or whatever.
So I guess it's whether you want to play aggressively or conservatively with Godo. Playing Godo is a lot like playing poker. I think the best Godo players will be players who find it easy or can read the people at the table. Read when they're feeling comfortable. That they've got that force of will in their hand, even though they're tapped out. When they're playing kind of nervous because they don't have anything, or when they're playing jittery because they're ready to combo off and that they're going to go off next turn, so you better try it now. Because Godo is not about going off as soon as possible. It's about going off when you think you can win. The point of having a fast combo deck here is you want to be able to get yourself ready for the opening that comes up. And if that opening isn't ready, then we get to play some stacks pieces or whatever to increase the probability that our next chance can go off, or to make the game harder for our opponents. So I think knowing when to go off is the hard part in Godo. And it's where player skill comes in the most, I think. That and mulliganing.
I absolutely agree. And I love that poker analogy. Honestly, that's one of my favorite things about cEDH is I get to play an incredibly high power, high stakes with no stakes at all multiplayer game. And so I really enjoy those poker type aspects. And I think that's part of what makes me like this deck so much. It is a huge misconception. And I watched some, I've loaned my deck to folks and watched them play it. And besides mulliganing decisions, you're right. The hard part is, I just jump in every time right away. And that's not always the right call. And it takes some skill. You need to know the meta. You need to know the other decks at the meta. And you need to be able to read the people at the table. I got a ton of comments and messages when the Playing with Power video came out recently with the For Godo pod, which was super fun, of why didn't you go for it? You had win in hand. It was telegraphed to the table that I had win in hand. There was a ton of table talk going around, and I misread the table. There was another player with also known win in hand, and I misread interaction for that player. It's as simple as that. Hindsight being 2020, should have gone for it. I didn't. But that's what makes this deck, in my opinion, so much fun to play. Is exactly, the end result is usually winning exactly the same way. Getting from A to B is the fun part.
And I think it's also maybe one of the reasons why people who have tried the deck sometimes underestimate the deck or shit on the deck a little bit. Sorry, am I allowed to swear? Okay.
Yeah.
So, if you play this deck a few times and you just keep a fast hand, and you just go for it at your soonest opportunity, and 3 blue players have mana open and you lose, which is what's going to happen if 3 blue players have mana open, or you just fail, and then you concede and throw the deck away, then you're not going to have a good time with Godo. Godo's not going to leave a good impression in your mind. But if you wait for the opportune moment for those blue players, for one of them to try to go off and everybody to throw their counter spells all over the place, and then everybody's tapped out and you just win, that's how you win with Godo.
Yeah. One thing we have here also, I just wanted to throw in, because in case someone who's new to the deck doesn't realize, Emergent Zone, it's a cost reducer. You can also tutor that up with one of the many tutors we've talked about. So it's also the thing with Emergent Zone as a cost reducer is that, unlike a Final Fortune, which you can is a cost reducer on your own turn, but that can also be used to kind of get surprise wins when in people's end steps, right? When people are tapping out and let's say it's right before the Thrasios player's turn, and they're tapping out to activate Thrasios because they're expecting to untap. You can kind of get a cheeky Final Fortune in there and untap, go to your turn and combo. Emergent Zone can't quite do that because you do need to go to combat to actually win, but it does function as a cost reducer in like the
you
end
drop
step right
drop
before
Godo into play.
your turn. And if people aren't paying attention, then you can get some.
You can also drop
nice wins
Godo
that
into
way.
play on someone's end step. Doesn't have to be the end step right before your turn. It can be the end step where everybody's tapped out. And if you've read the table and you think there's no after the fact answer, someone had a counterspell but they tapped out to activate Thrasios, and you think that was the only answer, then you can just jam Godo then, and then if the next player doesn't have a sorcery speed answer, you just win.
Okay. Then next up, someone wrote here about luck versus skill.
Yeah,
you
so
wanna speak to that.
I think this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't play Godo. If you like playing decks that are able to showcase your skill at the mechanical side of Magic, tutoring for the perfect piece here and the perfect and being able to use your tutors to tutor for an answer or to tutor for your combo piece, and you want to have that flexibility of having lots of in-game decisions, Godo is not the deck for you. You have to throw that aside, and Godo is a deck where a lot of your decisions are made for you, aside from when to go off, and a lot of the deck will rely on luck. It wins a lot because it's very powerful, not because necessarily you played well. And like Possibility Storm is kind of a divisive card for that, because people play Possibility Storm and sometimes you lose. Sometimes they do flip into the perfect answer, or someone ridiculously flips into Doomsday and just sets up a win and just wins. But most of the time they don't. Most of the time they lose. And if you can play a card that's 5 mana that says most of the time I win, I'm going to play that card.
You win.
Most of the time I win.
And finally,
I think that real quick, the luck versus skill. I think that the skills that are demonstrated are different. I agree. There's a subset of people that just don't like playing this deck. One of my very best friends in the world is the quintessential Storm player. He does not enjoy playing this deck. Because what he wants to do is put all of those interesting interactions together in unique ways and see, how can I play this one paradoxical outcome to generate the most mana and cards off of it. Spoiler alert, it's a lot. But that's what he enjoys, and that's the skill that he got really good at. But it's the poker type skills that really demonstrate themselves well in playing Godo. And unfortunately, that leads to a misconception, I think, that Godo is an intro deck, and I don't believe
I think the other part of... Sorry, go on, Azrael.
I think another skill that people overlook sometimes is like mulliganing. Like being able to mulligan well is good for all decks, sure, but I think it's a little more so for this deck, because some people say like your game is decided on by whichever hand you keep, sure, but you can mulligan it multiple times depending on what you want to play into. So do you want to mulligan into a fast hand in the pod? Sure, do that. But you can also mulligan into like more like grindy, stacksier hands based on the pod, and I think that's a skill some people overlook a little bit.
Well said. And the final point here we have is on turn order. So what's your advice on that?
Turn order matters with this deck. If you're playing directly after a heavy control player, it can make it really difficult for you to be able to go off without protection. So you have to think about that right at the beginning of the game. Look at their commander and go, oh, they're playing, Tassiger or something. I don't know. And you look at that and go, okay, I need to prioritize a hand that has a red blast or a defense grid or something like that. I'm going to have to play a little slower. I'm going to have to wait for the opportune moment, or I'm going to have to wait for them to run out of resources by countering other people's wins. It's a little harder than if the heavy control decks are playing right after you, where you can wait until the Gitrog player that's to your right tries to go off and then use that opportunity to win. Where in that case you can just keep a hand that just has lots of mana and wins on turn 3.
Awesome. And we have to wrap things up, we've got 3 listener questions, and we can answer these pretty quickly. So Gappy asks, what are Godo's weirdest matchups? Not necessarily easy or difficult, just specifically weird, if they exist.
Well, 3 other Godo decks was kind of weird, but a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely go and watch that on Playing with Power's YouTube channel. That was funny.
I think Jaliva might be a weird matchup, and maybe in a similar vein, Paco, where they have a chance of exiling top of your deck, and sometimes they'll hit like your Ogre or Helm before you've got a chance to search it, and it just makes games a bit awkward.
What about Yisan with the ability to threaten instant speed, artifact enchantment removal that you guys don't really like interact with? Is that weird, or with the
I'll talk
Ras,
to
is that
Yisan.
okay?
Yisan is a deck that you have to be playing when you mulligan. If there's a Yisan deck at the table, you have to either be able to go off on turn 2, or you have to have something that interacts with Yisan. Either you have to kill him once, at least once, or you have to be able to curse totem him or do something along those lines. You can't just play a game that wins on turn 3 or 4. 3, depending on turn order, you can get away with, but 4, no. So yeah.
Remember that middle hand that we showed you earlier in the mulligans discussion, where it gets there eventually,
you can't
but doesn't
play
really have.
against
Yeah,
Yisan.
no, that goes away.
That hand is unplayable against Yisan. You will lose.
Okay. Ishmokin asks, my question for the podcast would be, in your opinion, which is the best direction to build Godo? Race cars, all in Godo, Godo stacks, Godo mid range, and why justify this opinion?
I think for a blind meta, which is what the primer is designed for, I think you just kind of run the best cards that you can, and the best cards from each of those categories. You run the best ramp cards. I don't like running a lot of the rituals just because they cut down on your ability to have resilience. The 2-mana rituals and stuff. We still run Rite of Flame just because you can power out stacks pieces and very early with it. But I think, you just kind of run the best of a little bit of everything. But for very specific metas, if you have a local meta that you play in a lot, I think that kind of just depends on your meta. And I think Godo, luckily, does have a lot of options for different metas. If you're playing in a creature meta, you can just throw in 10 rats if you really want to. I mean, maybe 10's a little overkill, but if there's a lot of artifacts, you can run Fiery Confluence and things like that can double as one or the other. You've got things like Shattering Spree, which is a great anti-artifact card against an Urza deck or something like that.
Okay.
There's a lot of good anti-blue tech out there that you can throw in if you happen to play in an almost exclusively blue. You're playing against Kefnet and Baral and whoever else on the reg. Well, sure. Let's run Burnout. Let's run Boiling. What is it? Boiling Seas or whatever it's called.
There's Boiling Seas and Boil. They both do the same thing.
So there you go. I mean, there's definitely options. I would say that again, a lot of times what I see, and it's rarely it's on the cEDH channel. Sometimes it is, but a lot of times on other EDH Facebook groups, when Godo comes up, it's in the vein of, well, it's nothing but just acceleration and a Helm of the Host. And I don't think that's the right call. The place that acceleration and the Helm of the Host does best, where it's just all the ramp and that's it, where that's going to succeed the most is the place you shouldn't be playing this deck, which is pub stomping. That deck is going to win on turn 1 or 2, or you're going to be, because you're a horrible person and you're pub stomping, right? You're going to say, oh, well, this is dumb, and scoop your cards and then go beat somebody else on turn 1 or 2 every time, because they're not playing the kinds of decks that are doing anything on turn 1 or 2 but ramp. So don't do that, and that's where the nothing but speed would be successful. You try to do that in a meta that's actually tuned for dealing with threats on turn 1, 2, and 3, you're going to have a bad time. So I agree. Move towards the stacks, move towards the resilience. Maybe not go 100% stacks, although that's an option for you if you like trying to play that way. I think the best is kind of somewhere in the middle.
Okay. And finally, Jordan asks, I would appreciate some discussion on budget if you can. So how good does Godo operate on a budget?
I think Godo's great on a budget. I think there's some of the most powerful cards in the deck are irreplaceable, unfortunately. Things like Soul Ring. Soul Ring's cheap, but Mana Crypt is not cheap. Grim Monolith is not cheap. But Mana Vault is reasonably cheap, and so is Assault Monolith. which we run as well. Lion's Eye Diamond is not cheap, but Lion's Eye Diamond I don't think is essential for this deck at all. I think it's a good card, but I'd be totally happy swapping it out for something else. It's not a core card. City of Traders is way more core.
Yeah, that's one of your last big pickups.
City of
LED
Traders is a card that's irreplaceable as well. But all of those things are just mana acceleration for the most part. And so you can just run other accelerants, and if your stuff is too expensive, you can just run a Trilobite or there's multitudes of other cards that are almost good enough that are cheap, inexpensive cards. And yeah, maybe you're comboing off one turn later than you would here. But at the same time, if you're running that sort of deck, I wouldn't necessarily try and run for the race car Godo either. I don't think that running race car Godo in that sort of meta, you can definitely pub stomp with it, but I think you can have a lot more fun if you run some more interaction and stuff.
Yeah, so I think I'll speak to this a bit as well, and that's that you can replace a lot of the more expensive ramp pieces with cheaper cost reducers, like you mentioned, Trilobite. You can put in Molten Echoes, some stuff like that. You can put in more 2 CMC rocks, and kind of go that route. But then also, Godo as a budget deck overall, and maybe as an intro cEDH deck, I think personally it's one of my favorite decks to recommend to new players. And this is people who are new to, specifically to the cEDH format itself, because you can build it on a budget. It does have a pretty decent upgrade path, and most of the upgrade paths are like staple cards that are going to see play in other decks. But most importantly, for people who are getting introduced to the format, Yisan has been the kind of go-to recommendation for a lot of people. But Yisan, in order to pilot well, requires not only extensive knowledge of your own deck and all the lines and permeations you can take, but also of your opponent's decks, because it really does play like a almost draw go deck where you're sitting on your Yisan activation, and sometimes you need to preempt your opponent's turns with a Thought-Knot Seer or something, or find the right stacks piece the turn before you need it. So it requires extensive deck knowledge and knowledge of the meta already, whereas Godo, being a much more proactive and less reactive deck, you really only need your knowledge of your deck, and it's a pretty simple deck to understand, all things considered. So it gives new players the time to really pay attention to what their opponents are doing and absorb more of what the cEDH meta is like, and how people play and things like that. And it's less times sitting there thinking, oh god, what am I going to do next, what should I counter, blah blah blah. So I really like Godo as a budget deck and as a recommendation for newer players, even though as I believe Tony pointed out, the mulliganing can be a bit of a hurdle to overcome. I still
you gotta have balls for the mulliganing. You have to be willing to mulligan into nothing in order to get rid of mediocre hands. Sometimes you do wish you kept an earlier hand, but more often than not, you flip into a much, much better hand.
I also believe someone on the Discord server, is it Hisp, who has a link to some really good budget
he built a
Godo
pre-con Godo list, which is linked in the primer. And it's basically, he was trying to build a Godo list that could be built and operate at the price of one of the pre-con decks. And I would say that deck is way better than any of the pre-con decks, or at least more powerful.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to thank you guys for joining me. That about wraps it up for this episode. If you guys would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/intothenorthpodcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo, and to our long-suffering podcast editor Roadkill. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.
Cool, thanks for having us on.